Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where Mike and I are famously giving our Olympian judgment up from high in the clouds of all of the right and wrong doings of mankind, much in the same way that the Greek gods might have done many years ago. Of course, the problem being that it is, unfortunately, a foggy day. My name is Kawal Campo.
Oh, you remember to say that this time because now you're starting.
Only barely.
Yeah, I'm Mike Pierce, I think. Yes, and today we are starting a new mini series. It's just going to be 3 episodes on C.S. Lewis's perhaps most important book, The Abolition of Man.
Yes, and this is not the first C.S. Lewis book that anybody reads, is it? I mean, it was one of the ones that he was the most pleased with, and I feel like it becomes more and more important over the years.
Yes, but it's not the easiest. And part of our self appointed task here is to unpack this a little. Well, we're coming in really easy today because mostly what we're going to be looking at is C.S. Lewis, the man. Maybe the majority of our viewers will know quite a bit about him, but some won't. So we're going to be covering that, even if for a lot of people that's revisiting fairly familiar territory and saying a bit about the book and its importance. But we're really going to get down into the weeds and the nitty gritty, so to speak, next week. So, yeah, that's where we're going today. So, we'll start off simply by considering who was C.S. Lewis.
Now, you are a gigantic fan of Lewis, I know. Maybe even fangirl status, we
Yeah,
might say.
yeah, fangirl, that's it. Flutter of eyelashes
So,
briefly.
yeah, yeah. So do tell us, how did you first encounter him and what was that like?
Well, I think I first heard about him in grammar school, actually, which is in the UK, like secondary school from the age of about 11, from my maths teacher, of whom we were all absolutely terrified. He was he was a brilliant teacher, though. My gosh, my maths had never been better because we were so scared of this. So I think I heard about him from him, and then at some point, and I can't really remember when, I encountered at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and some of the other books about Narnia, but didn't really get into the more serious stuff until, I suppose, into my 20s. Now, the same question to you. What did you encounter first amongst his writings, and when, and what kind of impact did that have on you?
Yeah, I mean, much the same. I was, I don't know, probably around that age, and my mom always had the Narnia books around, and I'm sure she read them to us because she's a great mother when we were little, and so that was definitely my first exposure. And I just thought they were, as a kid, they're just the most wonderful books. They're so much fun, and there's something really uh just really magical about them that I feel like pulls children in. And then at some point, when I got older, I realized he had a bunch of other things to read and sort of took off from there. And similarly, have just been completely enamored with him ever since.
Right. Now, what was the first thing that you read? Do you remember, other than Narnia?
I think it was probably Screw Tape Letters.
Okay.
I I think I tried to read Mere Christianity. I grew up in a Christian house, so,
Right.
it seemed logical to read Mere Christianity, but as a kid, I couldn't stick with it, and so I tried Screw Tape Letters, and that was an interesting ride,
Right.
which we can talk more
Yeah.
about
We'll
that
talk about
later.
both of those in a few minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But your daughter's house in Oxford is just a few hundred yards from, well, not his place. I suppose now it's a memorial to him, but what's that like? I'm sure you've been there.
Well, yeah, the Kilns is his house out in Headington, or beyond Headington, actually. And it's a pretty ugly house. There's nothing beautiful about it. And it's in a fairly ordinary sort of area.
Right.
But yeah, it really is just a few hundred yards from their house. So that's kind of nice. Yeah.
Hallowed ground that she's living
Yeah,
on.
something like that. Yeah. Well, actually, they've just in the last 6 months or so, they've moved a couple of miles further away to a rental house, but they still hang on to the house that's near there.
Right, right. And now you actually had a special quasi connection to his favorite watering hole.
Yes, yes, because where I did my postgrad stuff, my master's and doctorate, was at a college literally just 200 yards from the Eagle and Child, the bird and baby, as we called it, where he used to meet with the Inklings. I think it was every Tuesday or once a week for many, many years. So with Will Tolkien and various others there. That pub sadly closed down during COVID-19 and is not going to reopen. That's the end of it. I mean, there's loads of pubs closing down in Britain generally over the last few years anyway. COVID did for a load of them. And that sadly was one of them. I have to say, there was nothing particularly special or spectacular about the pub. There's some extremely nice pubs in Oxford, and that was a very ordinary one. So, and I think loads of people went there because it was the C.S. Lewis pub, and then got in there and thought, oh, nothing very special about this. Same as his house, really.
Well, I suppose in some sense he was just an ordinary man.
Well, yeah, well, yes. So here is a ridiculously abbreviated version of his life, just coming up with some of the most important points. He was born in Belfast in 1898, but you look at his surname, Lewis, and you think, that's not really Irish, that's more Welsh. Well, his parents, or perhaps his grandparents, had moved to Ireland from Wales in the 1850s, something like that.
Now, his mother died when he was 9, didn't she?
Yes, and this had an enormous impact on him emotionally. Obviously, that changes the whole cast of his young life, really. And he gets sent away to boarding schools. He wasn't very happy there. And this comes back really in at least one of his later writings. People who are familiar with the Narnia stories might remember that in the prequel, ghastly neologism that we now use these days, the prequel to Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the magician's nephew, the young lad Gregory, his mother is dying. And right at the end of the book, he has something that he can take back from his travels to Narnia that will heal his mother. But one can't avoid the obvious conclusion that this really affected him very deeply. But he was a very, very bookish child also. I mean, one thing that was not in any short supply at all in his home was books. And he says in later autobiographical writings that he just stayed out of organised activities. He wasn't interested in taking part in sports or any clubs or anything like that. And he just wanted to be on his own and read and read and read. And I suppose that accounts for the sort of person that he became.
Yeah.
Well, so he goes to Oxford to study, and here we have a picture of a bunch of students in University College, Oxford, in 1917, and Lewis is in the back row on the right, and we can just zoom in and see him a bit more closely here. But in fact, his time at university was interrupted because he was called up to fight in the First World War. And that again affected him radically, as it did almost all of the men who had to fight in that appalling conflict. I mean, my own grandfather was there for the whole 4 years, actually. And of course, it affected him deeply as well. So, yes, that was something that was very important to him, and certainly gave him a rather sober sort of view of the world. Now, he had become actually an atheist in his early teens and remained so down to 1931, when he would have been 33 years old. And by that time, he is on the academic staff in Oxford and had been for a number of years. And he describes himself famously as the most unwilling convert in England, because gradually, partly through his friendship with Tolkien and others, he'd been introduced to arguments that he found he simply could not controvert, and so ended up becoming a Christian in 1931.
Yeah, which really just proves that you can think your way into faith with God.
Well,
If anybody can, he
well,
could.
well, yes. I mean, that's not the usual. That's not the usual way. Who else can we think of that comes into that category? I suppose Justin Martyr in the second century. But I think in all cases, it's not purely an intellectual exercise, and I don't think it was even for him. One thing that really needs to be stressed here, because loads of people forget this about Lewis, is that his day job, as it were, was as a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. And that saturates everything that he does, including the book that we're going to be looking at in these 3 episodes. And of course, it greatly affected The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as well. So everything about those stories tells you that this is a man who knows these long-standing stories that have been there in the West and how to apply them or adapt them to a modern audience of children and young people. So,
Right.
yeah. So he's an author of works on literary criticism, and there's plenty of those, and theology, and apologetics. Anybody not sure what apologetics is? We've done a whole series on apologetics just about, I don't know, what was it, 4 months ago, something like that. Please go back and have a look at those. Children's literature, the Narnia series, and I put science fiction in quotation marks here. Space travel, anyway. It's not really scientific at all. It's explorations of philosophical and moral themes under the thin veneer of traveling to and from other worlds. So, yes. Now, I don't claim to have the full canon of Lewis's writings, but I've got a goodly chunk of them, and so we can have a look at those here. So that people can be aware of what I've been doing with my life, apart from baiting students, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we come now to a fairly recent book, if 2008 counts as recent, considering the biographical background to Lewis's writings. And this is one that you read some time ago when you were in college, right? Do you want to tell us something about it?
Yes, maybe one of the only books that I've read that you haven't.
Oh no, there's another one we're going to consider in a minute.
That's true. That's true. But yes, I found this to be a really great biography of him. Alan Jacobs really does a great job of displaying, I would say, a very real image of who he was. Because there are some parts of C.S. Lewis's adult life that there's not a lot of information about. And it's sort of, I don't know, confusing. But Alan Jacobs really deals with him in such a way that it's all very understandable that, that he really was a human just like anybody else, albeit a brilliant and and very well read human.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly had his shortcomings, as we all do, except you, of course. um,
Yeah, I mean, I was tickled in the Abolition of Man that he actually even says he admits that one of his shortcomings is that he doesn't love small children, but he knows that he should love small
right,
children. It's
yes,
it's really funny.
yes. You recognise that as a shortcoming in himself. That's right, yes. But I also get the impression that either he or maybe his household wasn't all that hygienic. I just get that strong feeling from descriptions I've read. So there we are. Yes.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's consider some of his more important books. And this is one that you said you read very early on. So for some people, Lewis is first and foremost the author of the Screwtape Letters. which are letters from a senior devil to a junior one on how to tempt or frustrate or mislead someone who's become a Christian. This was published in 1942 and was extremely popular. And of course, we've got to remember this is Britain during wartime, so lots of people picked up on this. But yeah, I found from polling students over the years that this is one of the books, apart from the Narnia stuff, that they are most likely to have read. But what did you make of it?
I found a lot of this book actually to be very comforting. The way that he could explain why Christianity feels so hard sometimes, you could tell that he had really grappled with some of the bigger questions of why things are the way that they are, and then writes about them in this, which is reading this is like a fun mental exercise because you've got to like turn your brain inside out a little bit because you're reading it from the demon's perspective, which is like, okay, these are the things not to do, or this is the opposite of the way that I want to behave. But I found a lot of it to be very helpful to my personal Christian walk.
Right. Okay, that's great. I mean, I have read this. I don't think it made as big an impact on me as some of his other stuff. But one of the other sort of fundamental texts, perhaps most widely known books by him, is Mere Christianity, which wasn't actually published as a book until 1952. It's based upon radio talks that he gave during 1941 to 44. And there's a whole lot of references in the book that make it clear that these are talks given during wartime. There are these kind of sideways references to current realities and so on.
This was intended for a very general audience, right, in the 1940s. But I feel like today, many people would actually find it pretty tough going.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you said you found it tough going, but maybe as a teenager you're allowed to. I was a bit disappointed that so many people in student age in college, said the same thing. And from this, I can only conclude that a general audience in the 1940s was a few steps smarter than a general audience today. So I found this confirming my own prejudices.
I think you might be right about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. But for the large majority, especially among young people, Lewis is best known, of course, as the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was published in 1950, and that was followed by 6 other novels, a prequel, as we mentioned a moment ago, and 5 sequels in 1956.
All right. Now, I know you have one. Tell us which is your favorite of the Narnia books.
I think it's probably The Silver Chair, actually.
Ah, I actually just made my husband read that because he hadn't, and I said this is one of the most important of the 7, and you have to read this. So
Madam, I knew
it's a
it.
good
You're a
choice.
domestic tyrant. Okay.
Well, if I am, it's your fault.
Oh, oh. Everything turns out to be my fault in the end. Yeah, I
You're
do
not
like that.
sorry.
Partly for the humour with this character he creates, Puddleglum, who
Yes.
uh, every time I read it, the voice in my head is speaking in a North Country accent like that. I don't know why he doesn't say that that's how he talks, but somehow it just suggests itself to me. So partly it's that, but partly it is what's the word I want? The just strongly otherworldly atmosphere created with the moment of tension with the witch in Underworld. That saying, "Well, there never was another world. There's nothing, no other world but this one up there. What do you mean?" That kind of wow. He does an absolutely fantastic job of raising the goosebumps on the back of your neck with that. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my favorite part is when Puddleglum says, "Even if it's not real, I'd rather live in a
Oh
world,
yes.
yeah, where this imaginary lion exists than to live in a real world without him," which is like, whew.
Yes, I've never been quite sure what to think about that because it seems to me to feed into religious existentialism, which I think is a big mistake, and I don't think Lewis would have gone for actually. But yeah, nevertheless, it's a moment of high drama, so we can give him that. Yeah. The other thing is, I mean, the novels are stuffed full of Christian allegory if you know that it's there. If you don't, it could pass you by. But if you do, you can see it there. And also, I found that he helped me a lot in teaching freshmen, particularly when we were looking at different doctrines of the atonement. And I knew that there was one particular version that they'd all been brought up on, and they might well have done better with something else. And I would run it past them, and the usual thing would happen. They'd stare at me as if I was some kind of heretic. And then I'd say, well, what do you think Lewis is expounding upon in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And then they would get it, and then they'd think, oh, he must be all right after all. What Lewis was
Right.
doing was giving an allegory upon a version of the teaching about the atonement that had been absolutely standard for at least the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And he would know about that because he's a medieval and Renaissance man. So, yeah.
Right. Yes.
Very helpful fellows, that Jack Lewis.
Yeah. Sometimes I imagine a little spirit of C.S. Lewis sort of living in the back of your brain
Oh,
somewhere.
no, at the front, all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
for my money, quite seriously here, Lewis is the best writer of the English language in the past 100 years by far. And sometimes when I'm writing something myself, I cringe at myself because I realize that somewhere in my brain I'm trying to copy the resonances of his style. You know, that is, in my mind, that's the gold standard of how to write. Yeah.
You're saying he's even better than J.K. Rowling?
Get out of my podcast, you wretched person. You're pouring in. Right. Okay. Back
Anyway,
in the classroom here, isn't it? Anyway, just for any of you that are not already aware of this, this was how I spoke to virtually all of my students, along with dreaming up
yes.
extravagant nicknames for some of them that they didn't really welcome. Yes,
Yeah, we were equally abused.
yes, you were. Yes. Okay, so then of course we have Lewis's space trilogy, exploring various modern themes. So Out of the Silent Planet, about going to Mars, then Voyage to Venus, and then That Hideous Strength, which is based on Earth, but dealing with spaceships and such. And then, now this is another book that you've read and I haven't, so please do tell us about it. Till We Have Faces, his final novel, published in 1956, and it's a reworking of the Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche.
So this is a really neat book, and I don't think I would have known that it was a retelling of a Greek myth, but it is absolutely full of mythological signs
References.
and references, yeah, that you can really see that's where his expertise is. But it's interesting because it's written from a first person perspective, almost like you're reading this person's diary. And I just love it because at the end of the book, she comes to this conclusion that all of these unselfish deeds that she thought she was doing actually end up being selfishly motivated. And so I just love that the book itself is such a great perspective check for everyone. I think, that we think that we are the hero of our own story doing these amazing things and come to find out that when you look in the mirror you're just a selfish person like the rest of us.
That sounds like it's at least as pertinent to our own times it was to 1956. My gosh.
Right, right. Yeah, maybe sort of a dismal conclusion
Yeah,
from
yeah.
that, but I found it to be fascinating.
Okay, well, just to finish up this kind of survey of all of his writings, we should mention that he writes a number of books of Christian apologetics, most notably Miracles. And of course, just a quick reminder here that he's writing at the time of high modernism, which basically wanted to say that there was a rational scientific explanation for everything, and that in any case that excluded the idea of divine intervention. The problem of pain, which is a more perennial issue in Christian thinking and which has been brought up as an argument against Christian belief since the second century, many other sermons and essays. So there's a whole lot of collections of his talks and articles. He wrote a lot of poetry, actually. He also wrote, most notably, A Grief Observed, which was a chronicle about his pain and his anger at God following the death of his wife, Joy. So we should mention her just briefly. So this is Joy Davidman Gresham. She was a brilliant poet, born into an atheist Jewish family in the Bronx in New York. She was a communist, but later on abandoned the party, and she abandoned also her abusive alcoholic husband and was converted to Christianity and came to meet Lewis in Oxford and wanted to stay, but that was difficult to do. So there was a marriage of convenience between them. But then once the marriage had happened, they actually decided that they really did love one another. So it then became a real marriage. But she was diagnosed with cancer in 1957, died in 1960. And A Grief Observed is a very hard book to read, not intellectually, but emotionally, as he grapples with his anger and his anguish at the loss of his wife. I'm not even sure, actually, whether it's a good book to give to someone who's in that situation. I think it's something that people need to read long before they get to that point, so that they are, as it were, forearmed. And it might be many people who disagree with me about that, but it's powerful, right? He wrote a whole load of literary criticism, predominantly about late medieval and Renaissance literature. And he also wrote a fantasy, The Great Divorce. Now, I have to admit that after The Abolition of Man, this is my favourite of all his writings. And you've read it too, right?
Yeah, I loved this one. Again, it really challenged the way that typical Christianity wants to look at the afterlife and wants you to believe that the afterlife is going to look like. And I thought this was such a better way of
Yeah,
grappling
although
with
he
that.
does say that it's no part of his intention to speculate about the relativities of heaven. It's really a lens, and I think the same thing will be true, by the way, of what we have in the Bible. It tells us almost nothing that we can know about the afterlife, but it's told us in a way, and certainly the same thing happens in the Great Divorce, in to enable us to reflect better on realities now and what their eternal significance is. And in that, he does an absolutely brilliant job.
Right.
It's about this guy who dreams that
Yeah.
he has a bus ride up to heaven with a load of rather disagreeable people who get there and don't much like it when they arrive. Yes,
Right. Yes. Yeah, and there's a guy who sort of guides him around, and it's George MacDonald,
who
right?
is his? I think Lewis's favourite writer, or one of his favourite writers. Yes, who's already there in heaven and
Yeah, I
explaining
think
to him what's going on.
right, yeah, he was a big influence for Lewis. Although I tried to read some of his stuff once, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it, but
Well, you've got further than I have because I'm afraid I haven't even grappled with him. Okay, well, now let's get on to at least introducing the book that this mini series is about, The Abolition of Man, which is really against modern and modernist ideologies. And let's kick off with a quotation from Walter Hooper. Now, this quotation, I had trouble running it to earth because it was on the back cover of my original copy of The Abolition of Man, which, as so many of us do with our favourite books, I lent to somebody and it never came back. And so the edition I have now doesn't have this, and I had to hunt around to find the quote. He says, if someone were to come to me and say that, with the exception of the Bible, everyone on earth was going to be required to read one and the same book, and then ask what it should be, I would with no hesitation say The Abolition of Man. It's the most perfectly reasoned defence of natural law, morality, I've ever seen or believed to exist. If any book is able to save us from future excesses of folly and evil, it is this book.
Walter Hooper was really important, right? Because without him, Lewis might be almost forgotten today,
Right,
right?
yes, it's amazing. I mean, Lewis was pretty popular during his own lifetime, but maybe not as popular as he is in certain circles or wide swathes of the population today. And it's really Hooper that got him there. Hooper was a young man from North Carolina who only met Lewis 5 months before Lewis died in 1963. Right. Lewis, by the way, died on the same day that JFK was assassinated, so in November. And Hooper met him in, I think it was the July, and basically took charge of uh, Lewis's canon of writings, got stuff republished, got stuff that had never been published into print, and spent his whole life as a one-man ginger group for getting him into the public eye. And in old age, Hooper was interviewed and asked, how does it feel to have spent your whole life's work on the work of another man? And he said, great, I'd do it all over again.
Yeah, and I would encourage anybody, as you once did for me, to go and listen to his interview on YouTube, because if for no other reason than when you're having a bad day, there's nobody else's voice you want to hear but this guy. He sounds like such a sweet
Yes,
man.
yes, yes, I think he was, yeah. So I would agree with Hooper's assessment, but with one major caveat. I don't think everybody would necessarily understand it because it is a difficult book. And I remember the first time I read it, well, two things I remember about reading it. One, I had to read a lot of his sentences twice before I got it. I was about 24 at the time. And the other thing I remember is that on a couple of occasions, I found myself bursting out loud laughing, not because there was anything remotely funny about anything that Lewis said, but because I realized this was so utterly brilliant that there was no comeback to what he was saying. And many decades later, I am still of the same opinion. Yeah, I would say that it is the best book I have ever read. So, The Abolition of Man has been widely translated. We've got here a picture of the Macedonian edition that came out in 2018, published in Skopje by Metanoia.
For which you actually wrote the foreword to.
Right. My friends who were in charge of the translation and publishing this knew how much this book meant to me. In fact, I had already given some lectures on the topic of this book in Skopje about 5 years before that. And so they emailed me, would you like to write a short foreword, maybe just a page and a half? And within 45 minutes, they had it. And so there she is. I wrote it in English, obviously, and then that got translated to Macedonian. My command of Macedonian is almost non-existent, but there we go.
If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, we'll send you a signed copy for free.
Oh, I should be bankrupted. I don't even have access to them. They're all down in Skopje. If there are any copies left, there probably are some copies left. Yeah, it's already fine for you to make these promises on my behalf.
Yes, just kidding.
Well, what about the future of this book? He gives these lectures in 1943, but it was by no means obvious then, or for a long time afterwards, that it was going to have a really long afterlife. Well, here is P.E. Michelson, or Michelson, I guess that's how we pronounce him, of Huntington University, writing about this in 2008 with tongue firmly in cheek. In 1955, Lewis wrote that The Abolition of Man, quote, is almost my favourite among my books, but in general has been almost totally ignored by the public. The modern reader might find this hard to understand because the book begins with the entrancing subtitle, Reflections on Education, with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools. Not very riveting. Continues on with, wait, continues on. We do not, Mr. Michelson, continue on or retreat back or advance forward. We continue, retreat, or advance. But anyway, it continues with such hypnotic, interest grabbing lines as I doubt whether we're sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary textbooks, and finally gallops off into classical philosophy and the defense of ethical absolutes laced with frequent untranslated quotations in Greek and Latin. So he's having a laugh here, particularly with his own syntax. All right. Wikipedia, however, yes, we've sunk this low, points out that by the 21st century, that was no longer true, its obscurity, at least amongst intellectuals, both Christian and non Christian. In other words, this book is enjoying a very solid revival today.
And do you know why that is?
Well, I guess because the kind of logical positivism, which is the name of the philosophical school that was dominant at the time he was writing and for a while afterwards, is now very firmly vanquished. So there is at least room for it. And also because we are moving into a complete moral crisis. And although it's by no means clear that most people are likely to accept reality in this area, there are more and more people who are willing to do so. And that does bring us to the kind of concerns that Lewis raises.
Right.
Well, even in the 1940s, some reviewers could see clearly this book's true significance. And here's a piece from the New York Herald Tribune Book Review of 1947, so just 4 years after it came out. And this man is clearly very prescient. This quiet little book is uniquely calculated to infuriate John Dewey's disciples.
Okay, I know John Dewey isn't quite down there with Augustine and Rousseau in Piercean hell. He's still one of your hate
Yes,
figures.
he is, basically. It's acknowledged on all hands, including by people who like what is happening, that Rousseau and John Dewey between them completely dominate Western school systems and are, dear viewers, if you have any children, the principal reason why your children can barely read and write. Everything had to be referred to as
Thanks a lot.
self, right? Student centered approaches, and practical and non competitive. All of this relating back to them. John Dewey was an American atheist and socialist in the early 20th century. And a theorist about a whole load of things, including education, and was basically taking the groundwork of Rousseau and pushing it a whole load further. And I'm afraid they dominate teacher training and a whole load of other stuff today. Yes. So Walsh was quite right in saying that the abolition of man is tilting against all of that and all the other moralists who want to pick and choose from among the scraps of universal morality, who want to have their cake and eat it too. That is, people who wanted to debunk traditional morality on cheap rationalist grounds but nevertheless wanted to create an improved humanity with an interest in science and progress and all the rest of it for the future. Well, where do you get the value of knowledge from or wanting humanity? Where do they come from? Just out of thin air? No, they're rooted in traditional morality. Well, if you're going to get rid of most of it, why are you going to pick up those scraps? This is central, as we shall see next week, to Lewis's entire argument. In 1947, says Walsh, we still believe our realism, and he puts it in quotation marks, is directed towards some desirable goal. But unless humanity makes an abrupt about face, it seems likely that our grandchildren will have no goals. Wow. Well, that's very prescient. They will love or hate, caress or kill as irrational nature dictates, and no one will use the words good or bad, social or antisocial, or even expedient or inexpedient. And think about how the word bad came to mean in slang parlance. I think it was in the 1990s, came to mean good. And the traditional, even the terms good and bad, used in their traditional senses, came to be seen as judgmental. Right. So, yeah,
Mhm.
he's quite prescient. Well, let's just take a quick glance at this map here because it is quite important to remind ourselves of what's going on in Europe in 1943.
Now, 1943 was the year when, in retrospect, the Allies were definitely going to win the war, but it really wasn't at all clear to people at the
No, no,
time.
that's right. But by 1944, pretty much everybody on both sides actually can see that the war is only going to end one way, right? In 1943, as we look back at it, we can see that that was definitely the way things were going. But if you were living in 1943, it felt like the whole thing still hung in the balance. And we need to remember that Lewis is writing about the allegedly scientific worldviews and modernist worldviews that are clashing at the time. Right, this is both at the height of modernism and at the moment of its greatest crisis. Right, so that the modernist worldviews of nationalism and socialism, by way of very significant example, right, had their firmest hold at that time, a firmer hold on larger numbers of people than they were ever to have again. And yet it was the clash between those two things in their most extreme form that was absolutely central to the war itself. You think about Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, these are the most monstrous forms of those ideologies.
Which is interesting because he's really not making a political
No, he's
argument.
not. He's talking. He's clearing away the intellectual basis for thinking in those kinds of directions at all, which is why the book is, in a sense, an anti-ideology. Right? He's saying this is where we get to if you debunk traditional morality and you're going to snatch on to. He actually mentions, I think, it's as close as he gets to politics in the course of the book, the good of the human race. Let that be a placeholder for, let's say, socialism, or the value of my tribe or my country. Let that be a placeholder for fascism. But what reason could you have to value such things when you are in the process of battening down every other traditional virtue in the interests of that one overriding goal? There's no reason you can possibly give for it. And that's his point. Yes.
Right.
Well, having praised Alan Jacobs, this professor from Baylor University, by the way, and his book The Narnian a few minutes ago, here's another beauty by him, the year of our Lord 1943. And the great virtue of his book is that he considers not just Lewis, but a host of Christian writers who are active in that year against the background of those wider current events, and without which we can't really understand them fully. And especially, of course, the war itself. Okay, well, let's get down to the contents of The Abolition of Man.
Yikes. So we're getting into the actual book now.
Yes, just before the end. So we've laid our groundwork, and now we're going to lay out just a little bit of what the book's about. And next week we're going to look at it properly in terms of its central arguments. Okay, so it's published in 1943. It was first given as 3 lectures at King's College, Newcastle, which nowadays we would call Newcastle University, but it didn't exist then. It was part of Durham University up in the northeast of England in February. And that's why the book itself consists of 3 chapters of about 20 pages each. It reflects the fact that each of them was given as a 1-hour lecture or something like that. Interesting there, The Abolition of Man, then underneath author of Screwtape Letters, because that had come out the year before and had been immensely popular. So it's just reminding potential buyers. Okay, so we've got our 3 chapters and the titles here: Men Without Chests, The Way, The Abolition of Man. So Men Without Chests is an analysis of the crucial but assumed ideas of 2 modern English textbooks intended for, quote, boys and girls in the upper forms of schools.
So the chests are the connection between the head, spirit, and body, which is like animal instincts or desires.
Yes, yes, and he's saying that what's happening with the drift of modern education under the influence of Dewey, who he doesn't name, is to cut out the chests. And he says that we are both spirit and mind. We also are animals with a whole lot of animal desires, and they're connected via morality. And if you take that out, then we could go in almost any direction. Almost certainly it'd be the animal desires that will take over. But even if it's something mental, it can't give any possible reason for itself. And I suppose in Christian terms, and he's careful to keep Christianity almost entirely out of his discussion, that fits with what Christians have always said about human beings, right? That we have all of these physical type desires, but we're created in the image of God. We are a little lower than the angels. And what connects those very different strands in what it means to be a human being? Well, one of the most important things at a purely practical level is morality. So, in the second chapter, The Way, Lewis introduces the concept of the Tao, in effect, natural law, as universal morality, to which modern rationalism claims falsely to provide a compelling alternative based upon commonplace debunking.
So the Tao actually has nothing to do with the Chinese religion of Taoism, right?
Yes and no. He's not a Taoist, but he's using it as a term of convenience. There is very considerable overlap. But in a way, this is part of his whole point that traditional moral codes in different cultures do overlap very considerably. That the overlap is far more eye catching than the differences between them.
I've always wondered why he chose the Tao as sort of his representation.
Perhaps it just seemed a little less cumbersome than natural law, I guess. And perhaps by giving an example of another really important culture, he's giving an
Hmm.
illustration of the very phenomenon to which he wants to draw attention, that this is something universal. Maybe if he used natural law, he would have been stuck with being tied to the Greeks, and then it would be open to someone to say, well, this is just the way the West has gone. And he's wanting to say, no, no, this is everywhere. This is everywhere. That's just my own speculation. I don't know that, but I suspect that it is so. And the final chapter is called The Abolition of Man, in which he contends that the attempt to create new, supposedly rational values negates the only possible connection between our animal and spiritual natures, thereby casting us into the void. And he finishes the book with a couple of absolutely chilling sentences. A wholly transparent world, he says, is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. And the more you think about that, the less sleep you'll get tonight.
Well, personally, I'm not going to think about it for very
Well,
long then.
well, you're not going to get any sleep tonight anyway. You've got a baby.
That's true.
No skin off your nose. Okay, Rory. Well, thank you very much for staying with us. Please do repost this appalling product on whatever social media you bless with your presence. And we will see you next week to get right down into the weeds of the arguments of Lewis's book and to see how it works. So thank you very much, and we'll see you then.
Bye, everyone.